Okay, so what can we do today? Well, so we are sort of back to where we started in this course. But the thing was that I didn't want to do everything about patenting and innovations at the very beginning because I wanted you to have a little bit more experience talking about technologies and how we now can use technological knowledge and protect it and make it into something very valuable. So that is what we will talk about today. And of course, what you create in terms of innovation and intellectual property has to a large extent to do with how much you invest in that area. And one such indicator, one indication of how much money you are willing to spend on innovation is what is normally measured, which is the R&D expenditure. How much money as a function of the gross domestic product, right? So that is the sum of everything produced in a country during a year, and how large share of that goes into doing R&D. And normally, when one talks about R&D in relation to GDP, one is both talking about public or governmental money as well as privately financed R&D. And what you'll see that the countries that are, let's say, the more advanced countries, they are spending more money on R&D, and then one can ask, are they advanced because they are spending more money on R&D, or is it the fact that they are rich that means that they can afford to spend on money in this more, let's say, risky way? But I think if you go back some years, Korea was more a developing country and was lying quite far down on the list of countries investing and being able to afford a lot of R&D. Now Korea is in the top league when it comes to R&D investment as a function of R&D, and I think it's about 3.3% being spent. And you can see also when it comes to Korea, the blue dot indicates the spending about 10 years ago. So the share of R&D spending has gone up as well, of course, as the entire GDP. So it has been quite a strong growth of R&D investment, and I would like to think that has greatly contributed to the growth and prosperity of this country. So, and as I said, not just by the government, but also by companies. And it's quite clear that Korean companies now have much greater ambition when it comes to creating new products and having the most advanced technology, rather than being very good at, let's say, production and copying. So that is changing considerably. And the country that spends most on R&D, and wasn't really on the previous diagram, is Israel. But I think it's because so much of that R&D is related to defense or military. Sweden is on top. Of course, Sweden and Finland are very advanced countries. Japan, South Korea, Switzerland. Iceland, I suspect that Iceland, this was the situation 2 years ago, but you know what happened to Iceland? They were really, the whole country is bankrupt. So They have been helped a lot by their neighbors, including Sweden and Norway. But I don't think they are up at this level. But there are some countries and some companies that use R&D as kind of counteracting when things start going in a bad way. Wise leaders would understand that if things are going downhill, well, you should do something to make it go uphill, right? And therefore one should invest in R&D and the right things also within R&D. So Japan is increasing, USA is now slightly going down. In Europe we have some leading countries here, and China has been growing very fast, also in R&D, so it's a main competitor, of course, for Korea. So in a few years, increase from 0.9 to 1.4% in R&D, and I'm not sure, they're probably approaching about 2%, I would think. But that's countries, and now we are going to talk about companies, right? You are going to be important people in companies, I hope, and have a deciding voice when it comes to budgeting and strategy and so on. But when we talk about R&D, we talk very often about all the collection of all the projects, and that's what we call a portfolio. I'm not sure if you are familiar with that word portfolio, but it could be, a portfolio could be a collection of investments. A bank has an investment portfolio, or you may have a private, if you are very rich, you may have a portfolio of different investments. But for a company, aside from regular investments, it may have a portfolio of projects which should be strategic for that company. And we are now going to talk about the various aspects of investing into innovation and inventions and R&D. So, of course, the overall budget, in the budget process in the company, you have to decide how much money are we going to spend on R&D. And I know this very well from discussions in DNV when I was working there. And we used to have sort of a yearly battle, fighting for R&D money. And then in the end, it was the people in economy who came with a knife and sort of cut, sometimes not only once, but 2 or 3 times, and that was really terrible. Now it's it's been decided by the board a certain percentage of the total budget should go for strategic R&D, and then the business areas are responsible for their own R&D. So typical for a company, they may have some long-term investments in technology, into new areas that maybe the current business areas are not willing to invest in because it's too risky, right? But some money within a large company are collected at the top, and there they can be spent on, let's say, more risky projects. So it's how much to spend, and then of course the character of each project in terms of cost. And it's very easy to think, well, we'll spend so much on this project this year, but it's also important to think, how many years are we going to keep investing in a project? And there we should think some projects, should be fast-tracked. They should be finished in a year, maybe, or 2 years. And some projects where, let's say, there is very little competence from before, one may be willing to invest 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. So the cost to completion, and this is also a battle within the company very often, when to terminate the project, right? It's you being in a project, you always feel that you could do more, but then there may be some people higher up saying that that's it, you have to finish this year. And then the risk factor. What is the probability of a project leading to useful results, important results? And that is very often tied to technological maturity. You know the word mature? To be mature, be of age, be, let's say, developed. So is it a risky new technology, or is it an established, mature technology? Then for a company also you may think, is this something that contributes towards our competitiveness? And that of course is very, very strategic. In a commercial world, we always have to think about the competitors and preferably being ahead of your competitors. So does this project contribute towards the competitive position, the strength? Then there is project attractiveness. Well, that's more subjective, kind of a gut feeling. Is this the right type of project? So that is, yeah. And the impact, of course, in relation to contributing to the strength, and time to completion. I talked about time to completion. So when you look at the projects, and we are now going to look at some examples, we will maybe select projects, some that are risky and some that are not so risky, some that may be very costly, some that are not so costly. So it's the kind of the whole picture that is important when you do a budgeting and a strategic decision when it comes to investment in the future. And then there's something called the technology S-curve. This is supposed to be an S-curve, right? It looks kind of like an S. And here is the performance of the technology here. And then you have time and how mature is the technology. And you can see that when time goes by, the technology may become much stronger with time, but then it kind of reaches a maximum in terms of performance. And of course, the research effort has to be high in the early phases, but it doesn't really make sense, if you can only have a very small marginal improvement of technology. It doesn't really make sense to spend a lot of money on that, does it? I mean, that's probably the time to abandon, if not before, and make your R&D investment into something new. Maybe I should go back to this one too. So here, this term may be new to you, embryonic. That's when something is come to life, right? It's a baby before it's born. It's an embryo. So that means a very early stage in life, and then growth, mature, and then aging. So I guess I'm up here somewhere, right? Unless the curve has started going down again. And you know, you have to look at the business aspect of this too. So let's say you are now building up a new technology. And then the question is, should we launch a new business in order to make absolutely sure that we are ahead of the competitors? That's in the early phase, right? Or let's say we have not cared too much about this, but we see that, you know, the world is moving in a direction where this particular technology becomes very important, and we don't want to miss that train, so to speak. So that may be, you know, the earlier you are in this phase to establish a business, probably the better. And then, then this technology is not really giving much more. So should we invest or, you know, maintain the technology, improve the technology just in order to keep the position we have? Or should we rejuvenate? What does rejuvenate mean? A juvenile is a young person is a juvenile. It means, should we try to renew the technology, maybe by combining it with something else and bringing in a new element? And then when the technology becomes aging, you know, abandon. So one can talk about companies being of different nature. Some companies are really, they jump on new technology. And you can say when it comes to implementation of new technology, they are pioneers. But unfortunately, you know, when you look at history, it quite often happens that the companies that first jump on a new technology, they may go bankrupt because they don't have the economical strength to invest. And very often it's the first followers that or that follow just after the pioneers, they are often very successful. You know, this is very risky. This is a little bit less risky and gives often a competitive advantage. But then most companies, they are looking at what their competitors are doing, so they are, you know, following the majority. So they don't want to be missed out. So they follow what the other companies are doing. And then there are some latecomers, and then there are some too latecomers. Some companies may want to come in here for one reason. They don't really have the skills, but they may be very good at producing, right? If they are low-cost producers, they may decide to come in later because, let's say, they have very cheap labor. And of course, a country or a company that has cheap labor has some advantages, right? And so it may be low cost. The whole operation may be low cost. They don't have money to invest in R&D, but they make their money by being low cost producers. So while the others kind of leave that technology, there may be some companies that, let's say, continue producing on the basis of that particular technology. So, for instance, we talked about shipping, right? Different nations being leaders in shipping in terms of largest volume produced, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily the ones that build the most technologically advanced ships, but in volume they are large, right? And you saw the history from through the centuries of different countries being the leaders. We talked about that, you know, Britain, Germany, Sweden, Japan, Korea, China. And that may have something to do with, you know, the cost of production. But volume is not always what is most important. It's the value created, right? And for a company also, what kind of profit margin, how much money can you make on the production? So, you know, a low-cost producer often has a low margin of profitability. And this is another curve, which is, I think is really important for you to understand. So this is cost here, and this is time. And this is where you start investing in a new technology. Let's say somebody in the company has a very good idea, very promising idea, and it's decided to invest in developing this idea, this technology. But, you know, after maybe some time, you'll start trying out that technology in the market. Let's say after 5 years of development. You know, you test it out in the market. And in the worst case, you know, nobody is willing to buy it. It's not interesting, or the performance is not good. But so that's when you should stop. And very often, when it's seen that, you know, it's not the right product, not the right technology for the market, it's important to say stop. That's the difficult part. But, you know, in a better case, you'll start getting income, and after a while, you know, you have a so-called break-even point. What is the break-even point? Well, that is when your income has become larger than all your expenses. Right? That's the balance point. And from then on, you know, this could be very profitable. So, but, you know, I would say most cases, they go down there. Yeah. Yes?
How do we know then when the time to stop and how to survive in that area?
That's an important question. You know, you should have reviews during a development project, and maybe bring in some people to assess the project. So there may be technical reasons for stopping a project, because the technology is, you know, it's not really performing quite as well as was hoped. That is one reason. And when you get to this point where you start testing it out in the market, you know, the market will give you a signal. If the market is very reluctant to buy it, then it's certainly no reason to keep the project. But if this is let's say iPod or iPad, right? the market really wants that product, then it's like this, right? But it could happen that, let's say that Apple came up with trying out a new technology and it proved to be not such a good technology. It's important for them too. And when you talk to people who are on the inside of the company, and I've talked to one person who was vice president in Apple, and he told me some stories about things were not that simple, and some good ideas were also killed for various reasons. Infighting in the company, for instance. There are people involved. There are human factors, and that can be a difficulty, of course. There may be a very strong leader at the top who has his own ideas and his own preferences, and who is deciding, right? Well, I would say a wise leader should be strong, but he should certainly ask for advice before making this kind of axe decision, to stop. So all decisions should be based on, preferably on as much information as possible.
Is it always 10 years?
If it's always
10 years?
No, but it's quite remarkable, this 10 years. Sometimes you hear about the technology and it's implemented in a year or two. But, in reality, it's very often that, there's been a group working on that technology for quite a few years. So, for a really new technology, that's kind of the rule. It takes about 10 years. And the people at the top have to understand that really to get to this break-even point, they have to be prepared to invest for quite a few years. And of course, a good project like this one would pay for all the other failures, right? If you really can find the market and get a substantial income from a new technology, a new product, that will pay for your failures, right? So it's important to have a mix of different types of projects. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So this may look kind of confusing, and I have confused it even more by putting on these arrows. But this, remember, I gave you a reference book called Third Generation R&D. And if you look in that book, you'll find these examples. Well, as we talked about, when it comes to R&D portfolio, there are many factors that are important. And it's kind of a multi-dimensional problem, in terms of cost and risk and knowledge building and all that, and the market. But it's impossible to show all those factors in one diagram. So we are looking at, let's say, 3 diagrams having to do with a R&D portfolio. So that is, let's say, this is the budgeting time of the year. You have project descriptions for, you see, 14 projects, right? And then you want to characterize this portfolio, this gathering of projects. And you see these projects are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 14. And the diameter is an indication of how much this costs. In the budget terms, it's a big project or it's a small project. And so as a manager, you have to decide what projects are we going to invest in and what projects are we going to kick out, and what are we going to do with some of these projects in terms of maybe changing the scope? Okay, I think it's interesting to start with number 14. Okay, it's what is it in terms of technology and originality? It's certainly something very new, embryonic, right? That's really the start of a new technology. And what's the competence and the competitive position of the company in that area? Well, it is from weak to strong, or being very dominant. So in this case, number 14 is a new technology, but it's within a area. Let's say it's TV screens. Okay, you can think Samsung and LG. But it's a new technology, right? It's a new way of making TV screens. So the companies are already pretty strong, but the technology for these ultra thin screens is new, right? So, and this we could date this back a few years, right? So they decided to keep that project, right? But then there is another project which is not possibly quite as immature, but because we have this project 14, we don't want to have two very new technology projects of such large size. So what they have done is to take part of 11 and made it smaller, but it's not quite as immature and new as number 14, right? Then we see as another project with entirely new technology, right? Embryonic. But, you know, it's not as important from our competitive position. So that project disappeared, right? It could be three very new technology projects. One is kept, one is reduced, and one is kicked out. And then you can maybe see that you have another project here, which starting a little bit to the side of what's the technology of the company, but you change that project to make it more in line with the technology that the company has from before. So this is 10 going up there, and something similar with 7. And then some projects have been combined, etc. So that's, you can read different things out of this. So the diameter, as I said, has to do with budget, and you can see how you can change the scope if you are the R&D manager or another manager in the company, in a group that decides over the R&D budget, or we could say also the innovation budget. And then we have what's called risk reward, or reward uncertainty, but I would say risk reward. Okay? So you have, if you have fundamental research or more basic research, you know, the probability of overall success is not necessarily very, very high, because it's such new technology, right? But then you see, when it comes to reward, and this is the reward axis, you see number 14, you know, if that project, number 14, succeeds, the reward will be outstanding. You know, you'll take the market because it's so revolutionary technology. So even though the probability of success is not high, that's why you want to keep that one, because the reward is so big. And even 11, remember, 11 could have such a potential, but it has been modified somewhat in terms of budget size, etc. And 12 is gone, etc. So you can see, it's quite interesting here, that this group of projects that have only a small potential for giving a reward, what's happened with them? I mean, they are not interesting enough, right? They have disappeared, or they have been modified, to give them a more, let's say, better knowledge content, or a more exciting content that would increase the reward, right? So we don't like projects down here, with modest reward, right? We rather like to gamble and go for the big fish. You see that? And then also, this has to do with uncertainty. Is it technology that is known by the company? Is it new to the company? Is it new to the world? Remember, 11 and 14, they were really new technology. And it's new to the world, right? So, 2 of these are kept, 1 is modified. Okay? But even though it's the good thing about 14 is obviously that the company has people who knows, let's say, the physics of it. They have done things in that area before, not exactly with that particular new innovation, but there's a lot of competence. So that is, of course, a strength for 14, whereas for 11, the competence within the company is not that good. So that's why 11 was reduced. We'll rather bet on number 14. And remember, these probably were mainly reduced or eliminated because they gave a low reward, and it's within a knowledge area which is so well established, so they are not that exciting. So when you put this together, you see that was the proposed R&D budget, right? Project 14, 11, 12 that disappeared, and these other projects. And some cost saving has been achieved, right? The least interesting projects have been eliminated or they have been modified. But, this company is certainly committed to doing R&D. So that's the new profile in terms of grouping together some projects and seeing how much you're willing to spend. So that's an active portfolio management. An inactive portfolio management would be to sit down and say yes and no. And that's what's done in most companies. They say thumbs up, thumbs down, right? I think some of you may have experienced that, applying for research money, up or down. But what I'm saying is that, the decision process should ideally be a little bit different. There should be some interaction. Of course, some projects should be rejected for some reason. And there may be competition where one project is better than the other. But very often, people proposing here, people deciding here, and there isn't any real good interaction. Or at least the interaction goes only one way and not both ways. So active portfolio management should imply that people are really talking together. And the people who are on the technology side, they may not be aware of certain things that the managers know, for instance, about the market. And by talking together, the guy who came up with the first idea is thinking, well, if I do this change to the project, it may be better for the market, right? So that's interaction. Yes?
When do we know this is the right time to revise our portfolio?
Well, that is normally in a company, there's a planning cycle, right? You have a deadline for proposing projects, and then, you have this collection of proposed projects, the original portfolio, and then there should be this interaction. But, normally that is associated with the annual budgets. And the R&D budget or an innovation budget is approved by the board of the company as a part of the annual budgeting process, right? So the manager, the head of the company, has to sell this to the board that finally approves the budget. That's what it's like in most companies. The administration proposes the budget, and then the board of the company approves it or, makes some modifications. But not on a detail level. And of course, what a company board is maybe asking the top management of the company is, how did you do your R&D process? How did you come up with this budget that you are proposing for us to finance and approve? That's an important question from the board. How did you do it? Unfortunately, very often, the board gets involved in, should we spend this many ones or dollars on R&D, or should we spend more or less? But I think it's important, the process is very important. Then, of course, in some companies, you have, let's say, 90% of the innovation or R&D budget is part of this annual budgeting process. And then 10% is kept for good ideas that comes up during the year, right? To have some flexibility. And sometimes things happen in the market where you need to act quickly, or somebody suddenly sees this great opportunity. And, if that happens at the very beginning of the year where all the budgets have been fixed, there's no funding for it. So you have to wait one more year. But if there is kind of a part of the budget which is kept for being used during the year, then that may be the best way to do it. So, the innovation challenge, and I made up this one, which is kind of an extension of what we saw before. If you are here and then you are going to innovate, and you have one axis which is a new market, and one axis which is new technology, right? The newer This is the established, and this is the new technology. Established market, a new product or service. And if you have a new technology, a new market, and a new product, this is what is referred to as the suicide corner. You know, if you do all of these three things at the same time, then you are in the suicide corner. Well, of course, that corner is probably the one that could give you the highest reward, or it may be, you know, to jump into a new market may be the most difficult part, right? Maybe it's better to be over here. That could be high risk too, right? But at least you know how to interact with the market if you come up with something new. So, the suicide cube or corner. And let's take this one now. In this process, and some of you I know this expression already, SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunities and threats. And one can list all the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. So there are some examples listed here. And of course this R&D portfolio may be viewed in connection with a SWOT analysis. You know, is the company strong enough to carry this new technology with competence? Do we know how to deal with patents? Do we have experience? Are we in a market segment where we are strong, right? Or maybe, well, unfortunately our company is very new and we don't have much funding. So that may be a real threat also, right? If you don't have enough money to carry through this 10-year cycle. It can be a new market for us. We have few people in the company. Of course, if some of them quit, that is a weakness. Opportunities. We see that the market is really asking for this particular type of technology. New type of mobile phones or electronic books or whatever. Well, we have a new factory that could give us a very strong position when it comes to production. We have an international network. We are very lucky because our main competitor is bankrupt. Right? So, of course, this is just an example. But there may be things that could turn out to be a difficult thing in the future. For instance, competition. We see this other company that is now really growing very, very fast. Or we have problems with financing, or the economical time is not very good. You know, people don't buy products of this type anymore. You don't have the competence. So these are threats. So a SWOT analysis can be very good for a company to do, or it could be a department within a company, you know, for the key people there to sit down and brainstorm, you know, do a brainstorming of SWOT. Okay. I drew a sort of a picture here to illustrate that in a process of developing a new technology into something that is sold in the market, there are very many players. much more people involved than one would normally think. Let's say we have an inventor, somebody with a good idea. And of course, he may have as back players some people who are very good in science, have developed really the technology that is the basis for the invention. And there are also some people who could help in doing some proper analysis of the performance, for instance, of this idea. So there are some engineers, applied researchers, etc. Of course, if this is in the company, there is a research unit manager. Maybe it's not really an invention we are talking about, but somebody or a group of people having innovative idea. And so we also use the term innovator, right? Then there's people maybe within the company who are good at IPR, which IP, intellectual product. So we'll come back to this aspect when we talk about patenting. Okay. But if you are, let's say, not in a big company, but you want to really develop a new company, you need early phase financing, and then there's a term called angel. And an angel is something that may be not so familiar here in Korea, but in, for instance, California, they are very important when it comes to starting up new companies. And an angel is somebody who is really nice in one sense, because that person has a lot of money. That's nice all by itself. But that person is also willing to spend money on risky projects. So normally these angels, they are very rich. So they can gamble with their money. So maybe one can go to an angel and ask, can't you help get this started? I want to start a company. And then we also talk about a gründer. A gründer is a person who starts up a company. Of course, inventor, innovator, gründer can be the same, but it can also be different persons. An entrepreneur is normally a person who is very good at developing a company from scratch, whereas the gründer is the one who starts it. And entrepreneurship is normally, let's say, a little bit more extensive than just being a gründer. There are some people who are very good at starting up companies, but they are not that good at developing those companies into successful business. So if you're a gründer, you're not necessarily one who should lead the company over many years. Okay. Then you need, later on, you may need public financing, you may need private financing, you may need some business people and sales managers and people who can be responsible for the support functions within the company. So you see there's many people involved in the process, right? And one should respect each other and learn how to work together. But this is risky business, all of this. And people who are inventors, innovators, they often are willing to spend a lot of their own money, sometimes their family's money. They go to their parents or uncles and ask to help them, which, If you're successful, that is okay, but it can also very easily turn into a problem. So I know people who have sold their houses to start up a business because they thought they had such a brilliant idea, and very rarely that is the case. But we need, our society today need people like that who are willing to take a risk, right? Maybe the culture in Korea is somewhat different from, let's say, California, Silicon Valley, where I lived in Silicon Valley for 5 years of my life, so I know quite a bit about this. And they are very important there. I think in Korea you have, let's say, a tradition for very strong companies that do things within the company. But maybe in the future, there will be more need for people like that also in Korea. But remember we talked about brainstorming and being stimulating in the first phase, but then sooner or later you have to start asking the critical questions. And I think the time to ask critical questions should come before you really spend a lot of money. Okay? So in the evaluation stage, after the brainstorming, okay, is the technology sound and feasible? We talked about renewable energy. How much energy you can get out of a, let's say, system which is generating energy from tides or from waves, so it needs to. We need to bring in people to see does this really make sense? So the inventor, of course, is more or less blind, having this tremendously good idea, but other experienced people should be involved. So then I wrote the question: should we be polite, or should we be direct? I know in Korean culture it's probably people are rather polite, right? Particularly if, let's say, if there's a professor coming up with an idea, one would tend to be polite to him. Well, that is fine, but one has to be honest. One has to be direct and ask and really question what is proposed. And then you can ask about the market. Is there a possibility for a future need? That means a future market, or maybe there's an existing market. And sometimes, if there's a new technology, one doesn't know if there's a market. Then there's this term, a gut feeling. That's what you feel in your stomach. So one doesn't really have objective information to say too much about the market. And this is also where people start dreaming. They have an idea and they say that, well, the world market in this area is $50 billion per year. If I take 1%, only 1%, that's a lot of money, right? And it may sound like it's easy, but it's not necessarily so. So the risk is always you take a huge market and you say, well, I get 1% of that market or 2%. It's an enormous amount of money, but it's not that easy. Yeah, and for a company, is it consistent with the business strategy? And that's what we talked about in third generation R&D. Technology and business planning should go hand in hand, right? So find the right balance between optimism and sound skepticism. So one can be skeptical. So it's not easy. Oops, sorry. It's one of these things. Well, in one way, this may not be a very good example for Korea, because I noticed most of your lights are not based on a traditional light bulb with heating wire, So the traditional light bulb I don't see very much here in Korea. So it's more like what we have up there. But there's certainly if you start, and again, with some knowledge about basic physics, one can start doing calculations. How much could you save by replacing one light bulb by a fluorescent light instead? And you could save 500 pounds of coal and half a ton of CO2 emissions in 1 year. I think that's really staggering. But this technology is certainly on the way out. This is, the top of the S-curve, and there's a lot of new light diodes and things like that coming now, with different colors, being a little bit softer in its light than what we have here. So this is absolutely an area where new technology will replace old technology. It's like, mechanical calculators were replaced by the radio tube and then but by modern computer technology, of course. The transistor. Okay. So we have seen technology shifts in shipping, and it's important to be able to be aware. Of course, in history, sails to steam, paddle wheel to propeller, steam to combustion, from wood hull to steel head, and from riveting to welding, weldable steels, flags to radio communication to satellites, bulk to container. And now, is this where we are now? From oil to LNG? That's a good question. So it's very easy to look back and say, people who were late at going from sail to steam engine, they were kind of stupid. They were very good at making sailing ships. They made some enormously long sail ships with 10 and 12 masts. Well, unfortunately, it was very hard to turn those ships. But, it's possible to stick onto a technology too long. And this is a big question for propulsion on ships because of the new requirements for emissions from ships. So, be awake. So we go to IPR, intellectual property rights, and to patenting. So we'll start this topic today, and we'll finish that on Wednesday. So this is part 1, and Wednesday is part 2. And I'm sure quite a few of you have been thinking about patents. you know, it sounds very exciting, and it can be very exciting. But then there's again, it's important to be realistic when it comes to patents, and to know something about the process, what it takes, and what are the formal aspects of patents. And this we saw. They had several slides earlier in this course about inventions and innovation. Okay, and there are many definitions, but this is a good one. A new scientific or technical idea and the means of its embodiment, a difficult word, that's a realization, how to make it or accomplish it. To be patentable, this is for an invention to be patentable, it must be new, novel means new. It must have utility, that means it can have a practical purpose, and be non-obvious. To be called an invention, an idea only needs to be proven as workable. So you have to show that it can be made, but you don't really have to make it. You know, you can patent the part of something that having to do with a ship, but you don't have to build the whole ship to demonstrate that it can be done. To be called an innovation, it must be able to make it at an economical cost that is acceptable, and it must satisfy a specific need. So very many inventions turn out not to be very interesting from economical and practical aspect. So if it's applicable and has a purpose, then it can be an innovation. But if it only ends up in a drawer or as a number of a list of patents and never used, then it's not an innovation, according to this definition. So, interesting. Who made the invention? And there are two principles. First to file, first to invent. And in most countries, this is what applies. First to file. What does that mean? By to file, we mean formally submitting a patent application. So when you go to the official patent authorities, say, I want to have this registered as a patent application, and they stamp it and they give it a date, and you have to fill out some forms, you know, who are the inventors, and get back to that. Then that idea is in principle protected from that moment that then you turn in that paper. If nobody else has thought of it before, or patented it before, or shown it, demonstrated it before. It has to be new. We'll get back to that. But in principle, as soon as you have filed, you have your protection. But then in the United States, a person may file a patent, but then another guy comes up and says, you know, I thought of this idea half a year ago, and I can prove it. I was the first to invent, and that is what you can do in the United States, which is kind of scary, you know. So, of course, the person who claims to be the first to invent, he must be able to document it in some way, and it may have some a diary, you know, where he fills in what is done every day. He may send it to public notarization, the notarius publicus. And I'm not sure if you have that in Korea, but that's where papers are officially registered. You may have witnesses. You may have certified electronic document handling systems, dated lab journals, notebooks, their diaries, as I said. So that is possible in the United States, but as far as I know, no other countries. In all other countries, first to file is what counts. So if somebody comes and says, well, I can prove that I thought of this idea before this guy who filed the patent, it will not be accepted in most countries. You have to file it. It's not enough just knowing by yourself. You have to register that idea in terms of a patent application. And very soon, you know, people get kind of in a fever when they think they have come up with a very good idea that they have patented. And they start asking, what's in it for me? This guy here is very happily posing with mechanical snake that can crawl into pipes and into ruins and have a camera there and can look for things, right? But inventors, and these are some warnings, often have unrealistic ideas about making money from inventions. And very few ideas really turn out to be real innovations and commercially viable, that they have a commercial life. In the beginning, it's normally best for the inventor to be driven by other motivation than that of becoming rich. So, you know, if you think what you are doing is exciting, you know, makes you stay awake at night, and you think that this is very interesting, I would like to find out if it works. That kind of motivation probably is a much better driver than, well, I really don't like to work this hard, but then again I can make a lot of money. If that is the motivation, then one normally would get very disappointed. Very few inventions turn out in the end to be commercially successful. So it has to be commercially successful before you really can make money. And that, if it's a new thing, what did we talk about? 10 years? So you won't get rich the next year, I can promise you. Many companies have some reward schemes for inventors associated with submitted patents and granted patents. Sometimes you get a certain amount of money for submitting, and if the patent is granted, approved, then you get some more money. But normally it's not very much. It's meant really, if you are working in a company, it's meant as an incentive scheme, a motivation scheme. So, and really in most contracts, and I'm sure some of you have some contracts with the company you are working for, it may say something about ownership to intellectual property, to patents and things like that. Normally it says that it's the company that owns it. It's part of your job. And particularly if you are working in a R&D department, the managers will tell you, well, you are paid. You are paid to come up with new ideas. So that's part of your salary. But even so, it may be a good thing to have a reward scheme within a company, you know, just to motivate, but also give a recognition to people who are really creative. But also for a company, patenting is only one part of it. The competence of people, and there may be some very, very good people, key technology people in the company who are extremely valuable, even though they don't come up with any new patentable ideas, right? So for a company, that could in reality be just as valuable as submitting patents. So, but let's say you are not in a big company, but you are a inventor. And how could you make money from a patent? Well, there are essentially two ways, and neither of these ways are very easy. One thing is that you could hope for being able to sell or license the patent rights, because as the owner of the patent, that can be the inventor, or it can also be, let's say he's working in a small company, it's that little company that owns it, right? But if you're going to get some money for patent rights by selling or licensing, to license, do you know that expression? So if I sell it to you, you own it. But if I license the technology to you, I'm saying you can use it. You can use it in your company, or you can produce things on the basis I give you rights of using. But for every product you produce, you have to pay me so much. Or in relation to, let's say, the sales income, 1% should go to me. So that's the kind of license agreement that one could sign up. Okay? Sometimes let's say a good idea can be very valuable. And it may save, let's say it saves 8% in, let's say it's an invention having to do with production, and by this invention, the producer can save 10%. Well, do you think that the company would pay 10% to the owner of the inventor? No. The company would maybe pay 3%. Right? But even that, if it's such a good invention, then that could be very good. Okay? So there is an upside too. But it's a risk. If you look at it from the other side, it's a risk of buying inventions or license right. And as an inventor, you should not expect to receive an early large payment. And this thing with licensing, it's based on some experience and knowledge of law for establishing a licensing contract. And normally, if you are an amateur in that area and you're selling it to a big company that has its own lawyers, right? You are probably in a pretty weak position. So it may be a smart thing to consult with some legal advice. So that's one way. Selling rights by selling the whole invention, or the licensing, the right to produce. But you can also be a gründer, an entrepreneur, and you say, I'll show the value. Even if nobody is willing to buy this license, I will do it myself by starting a company and selling a product. And you may have several good ideas, and of course that makes you less vulnerable. You can keep on inventing. So if you could have a setup where you all the time come up with new good ideas, and you keep on protecting something that may be even outdated as a patent. I think in the LNG technology we are seeing that, membrane tanks, there are some patent rights that are long gone out, but there are new inventive steps that are added to it that is able to protect the technology. Look for strategic partners and then sell the company. Okay, so you have an idea, you develop it and make the product or whatever it is and sell it to the market, and then your company has a big value maybe, and then you can sell the company, including the patent rights. But it's tough. This is tough. How about universities? Some US universities have really pioneered reward schemes for researchers and professors, even students. And this university, Stanford, just south of San Francisco, they pioneered this. And MIT, another example. These are private universities. But now most universities have some kind of setup for dealing with patents coming from people within the university. And not only that, they have set up a scheme with a TTO or a OTL, which stands for Technology Transfer Office. Of course, the university is not going to be the unit that is commercializing. That is none of the university's business. But to build competence and come up with good ideas is the university's business. So the university wants to transfer the technology to commercial businesses, right? Or maybe help in starting up. Or OTL, Office of Technology Licensing. That says that the primary strategy is for the university to keep the ownership to the patents, but license this out. At Stanford University, I heard there are 10 or 15 professors who are billionaires in dollars. And obviously they have not earned that money by consulting, right? They have obviously come up with something that's patentable, or they've had a good idea, started up a business that has grown to a big value, right? So, for instance, around Stanford, you have Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett and Packard were professors at Stanford. You have Sun Microsystems, you have Apple, you have all these companies in the electronics and IT that have come out of Stanford University. So these offices will help investors finding those. Help the inventors in assessing ideas, asking the right questions, patenting, patent follow-up, financing, commercial contracts, license agreements. So they have a scheme of a set of people who can help you. So that's good in a university. But if you are an amateur outside a big organization, that will be much tougher. And reward scheme. And this is what's often referred to as the Stanford model. One part to the inventor or inventors, one part to the department where the inventors work, and one part to the university centrally, possibly through this technology transfer office. I don't know exactly what is the scheme here at KAIST, but there is something similar. But these, distributing the value here is normally based on a net income. So direct expenses are deducted before distributing sales or license income. And what we see more and more is that universities set up kind of a business support system to help starting up businesses. Get back to that. And that may be different from the technology transfer office, which is more having to do with patents and licensing. So, universities more and more are aware of the value of knowledge, and they like to also generate income on that basis. And you can say also it's the role of a university also to help business develop on the basis of knowledge in the university. From idea to cash, to money. Okay. So, if you have an idea and wonder if it's patentable, you have to do a search, and we'll get back to that. That's what's called prior art. Have you heard that expression? Prior art. That is what is existing in terms of knowledge or patents from before. And as we just talked about, to be patentable, we have to come up with a truly new idea. So if it exists, there is a prior art that really covers this idea from before, then you have to abandon, or you have to modify your idea. Or you can then, if it's new, interact with the TTO, get an evaluation, and maybe they say it's not good enough, it doesn't have the potential, and the TTO will decline, say no thank you very much, and return the invention to the inventor. Or the TTO, by looking at it, consulting some people, maybe say, this is very interesting. If it's not already patented, they'll help you with the patent process. And then, next step is to start looking for funds. And there may be a separate funding organization which may accept, want to put money into this, or they may decline, send it back to TTO, or accept and go for commercialization. So the purpose of a patent is not to get, let's say, a recognition of that you have been smart. Some people think that. But the purpose of a patent is to give you commercial protection. So it really only makes sense if you want to commercialize the idea. There's no point in patenting something that you are almost sure, fully sure of, will not be commercialized. That's just a waste of money. So, when you commercialize, it can be existing companies, or you can start a new company. Then we have something new associated with universities, and that is to help in the commercial phase when you start up a new company. There may be some big companies also who want to protect, if some people come up with a good idea, it may not be very easy to do that in a regular department in that company where there's so much going on, from day to day. Maybe these people need to be protected and lifted out into a separate building or something like that, where they are giving the resources necessary to develop this into a business. So such incubators can be set up by government, universities, research institute, private companies, and combinations of the above. And nowadays the politicians like to be involved in this. They like, let's say you are a politician from a particular city, you would like to, and there's a university there maybe, you would like to start up a facility for growing business based on new ideas. So that's, you start an incubator. When a baby is born very early, it's put in an incubator with the right temperature and oxygen, everything that the baby needs. So it's kind of a picture of what you need when you start up a new company. It's like a baby. You need nourishment, right, and help. So it's normal to the commercialization of knowledge and competence or ideas. Doesn't have to be really a patent. Yeah. So normally you start up by forming a new company. That is the normal model. That is to really point to responsibilities, because as soon as you say it's a company, then there is a legal framework for that activity. And the incubators are normally not for profit, but they should be self-financing after some time operation. And that is because they may get a cutback, a money also from licensing as a part of the contract with the startup companies. Yeah. Sometimes they are focusing on particular things like being a support for a university, or they may say we only help green technologies, we only are in biotech areas. So they can be specialized. Let's see what do we have. Yeah. So the services can be office space, help with basics of business management, networking, marketing, internet, IT, accounting, help with financing, loans, help with selling the idea in terms of presentation skills, links to people who are knowledgeable in a related area at the university, for instance, strategic partners, angel. Here you have the word angel investor, and venture capital. Venture capital normally comes into action a little bit later than an angel. An angel is willing to take higher risk, whereas a venture capital company certainly has as its basis to make as much money as possible by having the right portfolio of projects or startups or whatever that they support. Right? And they often wait a little bit for two reasons. One is to see if that startup company is beginning to succeed in the market. thereby reducing the risk. And sometimes, if the company has really difficult economical times, that venture company can buy it very cheaply, right? Squeeze out what's there. And since the venture company has a lot of money, they can, bring that in that is needed to make it a success. And they can provide business training, advisory boards. What an incubator setup often helps with is to find people who can be on the company board. Let's say some with legal experience, some with business experience, some with operating experience, etc. With experience from startup companies before. Management team, regulatory compliance, compliance with the laws, intellectual property. So it's, this is very exciting things for those who are involved. People who are in such an incubator startup company, they are normally extremely hardworking, dedicated, enthusiastic, and that's necessary. And of course, if you have success, you can be very successful. So don't think that I'm only, skeptical. I have seen many times that things are very successful, but on the way, you have to realize that this is not easy. That's my point. Yeah. Okay, but then we get more into patenting, and that we'll do on Wednesday.